Hi, Steve Rosen here. Before we jump in, I want to share why I created this executive briefing. Over the last 30 years working with sales organizations, I've seen something happen repeatedly. Organizations invest heavily in methodology, technology, enablement, and talent, yet forecast predictability still weakens. Not because strategy failed, not because people stop working hard, but because execution quietly becomes inconsistent under pressure. Coaching softens, pipeline discipline weakens, accountability starts varying manager to manager. And most leadership teams don't recognize the problem until it starts showing up in the numbers. In this executive brief, I want to show you why that happens and what high-performance organizations reinforce differently and what actually protects predictable execution when pressure rises. Let's get into it. If you are responsible for revenue predictability, whether as a CRO, VP of sales, or senior sales leader, this executive briefing is for you. Because most sales organizations don't lose predictability overnight. They lose it gradually, often in ways that are difficult to spot early. Not because strategy failed, not because the market suddenly changed, and usually not because talent disappeared. Predictability weakens because leadership execution becomes inconsistent under pressure. At the beginning of the year, execution often feels strong. Managers coach consistently, pipeline reviews happen with discipline, standards are clear, and forecast confidence feels solid. Then pressure builds, deals slow, quarters become harder, leaders get pulled deeper into opportunities, and urgency begins competing with discipline. This is when subtle shifts start happening inside the business. Coaching becomes less consistent. Pipeline inspection softens. Accountability begins varying manager to manager. Forecast confidence weakens. The challenge is that these changes rarely feel dramatic in the moment. By the time they show up in the numbers, they often have been building quietly for months. Over the next 20 minutes, I want to show you why forecast predictability weakens under pressure. What leadership inconsistency is quietly costing organizations, and what performance sales leaders reinforce differently to maintain predictable execution. Because technology creates visibility, leadership creates predictability. Let's get into it. Let me start with an observation that surprises many sales leaders. Forecasts rarely break loudly. They weaken gradually. And most organizations miss the early warning signs because the first indicator of risk rarely appears in dashboards. They appear in leadership behavior. At first, the changes seem small. Pipeline reviews become shorter, less rigorous. Coaching gets postponed. Managers spend more time rescuing opportunities than developing people. Standards that are often reinforced consistently begin varying from manager to manager. One leader rigorously inspected pipeline. Another accepts optimism. One manager holds commitments tightly. Another makes exceptions, and the organization still appears functional. In fact, numbers may even look acceptable for a period of time, but underneath the surface, predictability is already beginning to weaken. Here's a distinction that matters. Most organizations monitor lagging indicators, revenue, attainment, close rates, forecast accuracy. High performance organizations obsess over leading indicators, coaching, inspection, accountability. Because the time forecast problems become obvious, the leadership behaviors causing them have often been deteriorating for months. Execution rarely breaks loudly. It leaks quietly. At the core, at its core, every CRO makes a promise to the board, not explicitly, but operationally.
The promise is predictable execution. That means stronger forecast confidence, scalable performance, consistent leadership execution, and fewer surprises. Organizations invest heavily to make this happen. They buy Salesforce, they use Medpic, Gong, Clary, Revenue Ops, Enablement. Visibility improves, reporting improves, data quality improves, yet predictability often fails to improve at the same pace. Why? Because visibility and execution are not the same thing. Technology can expose problems, but cannot compensate for inconsistent leadership behavior when pressure rises. And pressure always rises. Deals stall. Markets tighten. Forecast expectations increase. The real question becomes, does the leadership system hold under pressure? Or do standards quietly begin softening? Because when forecast confidence weakens, executive scrutiny rises, board confidence erodes, leadership teams spend more time explaining numbers than predicting them. And that is the hidden risk many organizations underestimate. Most CROs do not lose predictability because strategy failed. They lose it because leadership execution became inconsistent under pressure. Over more than 3 decades working with sales organizations, I have observed something consistently. Pressure changes leadership behavior, not intentionally, but predictably. When pressure rises, leaders stop leading the system and start managing the moment. The shift feels reasonable at first. Everything suddenly feels urgent. Critical deals need attention, forecasts need scrutiny, customers require escalation. Leaders get pulled into the business instead of reinforcing the operating discipline that sustains performance. And three things typically happen. First, leaders become reactive. Instead of reinforcing execution, they begin rescuing outcomes. The challenge is that rescue work feels productive, but it rarely creates predictability. Second, focus narrows. Pipeline discipline weakens. Coaching gets postponed. Managers spend more time helping close business rather than building capabilities. This is the very activity that sustains long-term performance quietly begins disappearing. Third, leadership impact stagnates. Short-term urgency crowds out long-term discipline, not because leaders stop caring, because pressure redirects attention. And here is the hard truth. Leaders rarely abandon standards. They stop enforcing them consistently. That distinction matters because the issue is rarely intent. The issue is reinforcement. And whatever does not hold under pressure was never truly enforced. And I'll repeat that. Whatever does not hold under pressure was never truly enforced. Let's talk about what the actual costs, because leadership inconsistency is expensive, even when organizations don't recognize it immediately. Urgency creates activity, but activity and execution are not the same thing. When leadership discipline softens, four things usually begin deteriorating. First, pipeline quality weakens. When leadership discipline softens, deals move forward that should not. Qualifications become less rigorous. Discovery weakens, and forecast volatility increases. Second, coaching consistency declines. Reps receive less development, performance gaps widen, and results become increasingly dependent on performance carrying the business. On top performers carrying the business. Third, accountability becomes selective. Standards vary by manager. Commitments become negotiable. Follow through weakens. And selective accountability always creates inconsistent execution. The fourth thing, executive confidence declines. Forecast confidence weakens. RevTech investments fail to deliver expected returns. Boards ask hard questions. Leadership spends more time defending results rather than driving them. And here's the part many organizations underestimate. Small execution breakdowns create disproportionate business consequences because discipline compounds, but inconsistency compounds too. The organization that outperforms are rarely doing dramatically more. They are simply reinforcing what matters more consistently. So it actually protects execution when pressure rises. In my experience, predictable sales organizations consistently reinforce three things. Not occasionally, not when there is time, every single week, across every single team. Firstly, pipeline discipline. Healthy pipelines are not built on optimism. They're built through disciplined inspection. Opportunities are challenged. Assumptions are tested. Managers hold the line on qualification standards because when the pipeline discipline weakens, forecast confidence usually follows. Number two, standards remain clear. Commitments stay real. Difficult conversations happen early, not later, because accountability matters most when pressure rises, not when things are easy. And there's an important leadership truth here. The standards you tolerate become the standards you have, whether intended or not. Number three, manager development. Strong managers create strong teams. Weak managers create inconsistent execution. When managers coach consistently, capability compounds over time. When coaching declines, performance begins drifting. This is one of the biggest blind spots inside many sales organizations. Managers become overwhelmed operationally, and development quietly disappears. But here's the key insight. Predictable execution is rarely built through heroic leadership. It's built through disciplined reinforcement. When these three things hold, performance becomes more predictable. When they weaken, forecast confidence usually follows. When execution starts slipping, most organizations respond the same way. They add training. And to be clear, training does matter. Sales methodology matters. Enablement matters. Manager development matters. But here's the hard truth. Training alone rarely changes execution. Why? Because pressure always returns. Quarter pressure, forecast pressure, board pressure, resource pressure. And when pressure rises most, people revert to leadership consistently reinforces not what's taught once. Most organizations have experienced this cycle. A new methodology gets introduced. Teams leave energized. Skills improve. Language improves. Adoption increases. Momentum builds. Then reality returns. Managers pull back into deals. Coaching cadence weakens. Pipeline inspection becomes inconsistent. Urgency begins replacing discipline. And over time, execution quietly drifts back towards old habits. Not because the training failed, because reinforcement disappeared. This is where many organizations unintentionally get it wrong. They invest heavily in methodology, medpic, sales processes, enablement, forecasting tools, technology. Then adoption fades, and eventually methodology gets blamed. But the issue is not usually methodology. The issue is leadership reinforcement. Because sustainable performance is not created through information. It is created through reinforcement. Training informs. Leadership enforcement makes it stick. And that distinction really matters because most organizations do not have a methodology problem. They have an execution consistency problem. The missing layer. This brings to what I call the leadership enforcement gap. And in many organizations, this is where predictability quietly breaks. Most sales organizations already have standards. They have the processes exist. The dashboards exist. The methodology exists. Salesforce, Medpic, Gong, Clary, enablement, forecasting frameworks. What is usually missing is much simpler, consistent leadership reinforcement. Coaching to the standard, inspecting execution, holding commitments, addressing inconsistencies early, reinforcing what must hold under pressure. Because here's what happens when standards stop being reinforced. They quietly become optional, and optional standards create inconsistent execution. Manager quality begins varying. Coaching consistency declines. Forecast confidence weakens. Top sales performers disengage, and leadership teams spend more time explaining numbers than predicting them. This is why that is why I developed what I call sales leadership infrastructure. Because predictable execution is not built through motivation, it's built through operating discipline. At the center are three principles we discussed: pipeline discipline, doing the right work consistently; performance accountability, holding the line when pressure rises; manager development, building capability so performance compounds. Together, these create the operating layer that allows execution to hold, especially under pressure, because technology creates visibility, leadership creates predictability. And when these three disciplines are reinforced consistently, something important happens. Execution becomes less dependent on heroic leadership and more dependent on disciplined leadership systems. That is when predictability becomes scalable. Let me make this practical. We worked with pharmaceutical organizations that had strong talent, experienced leaders, and solid market opportunity. On paper, the business looked healthy, but underneath the surface, execution was inconsistent. Manager effectiveness varied significantly. Coaching cadence was inconsistent. Pipeline reviews or accountability reviews lacked rigor. Forecast confidence changed manager to manager. Like many organizations, the issue was not effort. The issue was inconsistency. Instead of introducing more training, we focused on reinforcing leadership discipline. Managers moved from ad hoc coaching to structured weekly coaching cadence. Reviews became more rigorous and consistent. Accountability shifted from selective to disciplined, particularly around commitments, inspection, and coaching activity. Most importantly, leaders reinforced the same standards consistently over time, even when pressure increased. Within 26 weeks, sales increased by 30%. Not because suddenly people worked harder, not because market conditions changed, because leadership execution became more consistent. We saw something similar at Medeska. The strongest gains happen when frontline leaders consistently reinforced expectations, coaching cadence, and accountability. This is a difference many organizations underestimate. High performance teams are not always more talented. They are usually more disciplined because discipline compounds, especially under pressure. Let me ask you something directly. If forecast predictability weakened next quarter, would you know exactly where the execution started breaking? Because execution problems rarely appear first in dashboards. They show up in behavior. Before numbers change, patterns change. Pipeline reviews become inconsistent. Forecast confidence varies manager to manager. Coaching happens less frequently. Difficult conversations happen later than they should. Standards still exist, but enforcement becomes inconsistent. Let me give you a quick executive diagnostic. Take 30 seconds and ask yourself, are pipeline reviews becoming inconsistent? Do forecasts frequently change without new information? Are commitments not being held rigorously? Is coaching happening less than once a week? Are difficult conversations being delayed or avoided? Do standards exist but managers' enforcement varies? Now be honest. If your answer is rarely, execution is likely a strength. Protect it. If your answer is sometimes, inconsistency is already introducing risk. And if your answer is often, there are strong chances leadership inconsistency is already affecting forecast predictability. Because awareness creates clarity, and clarity creates the opportunity to intervene before performance suffers. Let me leave you with one final thought. Most sales organizations do not lose predictability because strategy failed. They lose it because leadership consistency weakened under pressure. Coaching softens, inspections become inconsistent, accountability varies, and forecast confidence eventually follows. By the time the problem appears in the numbers, it has been shown up in leadership behavior for months. The organization that sustains predictable execution do something differently. They reinforce what must hold: pipeline discipline, performance accountability, manager development, every week, especially under pressure. So let me ask you, if forecast predictability weakened next quarter, would you know exactly where the execution started drifting? Because if predictability matters this year, guessing is expensive. The fast way to improve execution is to understand where it's already weakening. That is why I created the Sales Leadership Infrastructure Diagnostic. In one executive session, we identify where execution may already be drifting, what inconsistency may be quietly costing the business, where leadership behaviors are breaking down, and what must hold to improve predictability. No theory, no generic advice, just executive clarity around what is driving or limiting performance inside your business. Because strong leadership creates stronger execution, and stronger execution creates predictable results. Thank you for your time.
If there's one idea I'd leave you with, it is this: forecast predictability rarely breaks loudly, it leaks. And by the time numbers show it, leadership inconsistency often has been building quietly for months. So here's the question: if forecast predictability weakened next quarter, would you know exactly where the execution started drifting? Would you know if the issue is coaching, pipeline discipline, manager accountability, or inconsistent leadership reinforcement? That's exactly why I created the Sales Leadership Infrastructure Diagnostic. It helps sales leaders identify where execution may already be drifting and what must hold to improve predictability. You'll find the link below. And if this topic resonates with you, I'd welcome the opportunity to connect. Thanks for joining me today.